Hello, and welcome to episode number 118 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. Since the very beginning of this podcast, we've been exploring the various experiences people report having across time and across cultures that speak to outlier events that defy easy categorization, especially within our modern Western milieu. Here we're speaking of events that are not only just unusual, but that manifest in such a way as to appear, simply put, impossible, at least according to so-called modern understanding. Because of the bewildering does not compute nature of these events, we've often resorted to doubting the witnesses themselves, calling them everything from prone to exaggeration to delusional to frauds. And yet the vast numbers of these events, once you dare begin to collect and collate the data in a dedicated, objective fashion, suggest such easy, and let's call a spade here, lazy dismissals simply can't stand as a legitimate assessment. Indeed, on this podcast, the sheer preponderance of these highly strange experiences has led us to not only catalog and compare them, but also to ask, what model of reality could possibly emerge to help us understand them? If these events are really quote-unquote happening, then what does this say about the nature of our reality itself? Some would suggest, and have long suggested, going back to the dawn of our civilization, in fact, that we have everything upside down and inside out. That is to say, from this perspective, the problem lies not with these so-called outlier experiences, but with our insistence that this, which is to say everything we see manifesting around us in apparently solid physical form, is actually base reality. These people would unapologetically suggest it is in fact not, that this is a hall of mirrors, if you will, a carefully crafted illusion that hides behind a veil a deeper, true existence, one not defined by the duality that we see so evident in our day-to-day lives here. The movement and our perspective we're speaking of here is colloquially known as Gnosticism. Gnosis is a Greek term meaning knowledge, specifically direct experiential knowledge of the divine or ultimate reality. Adherents of Gnosticism are quick to point out that this is not mere belief arising from external authority or doctrine, but rather a knowing based on direct first-hand experience. This notion of a direct, first-hand, felt sense of the ultimately real helps us make sense of why so many experiencers report these events as being, quote-unquote, more real than real. If these people are indeed experiencing modes of existence and or states of being beyond the veil, as it were, then this is, of course, exactly what we would expect them to report. It's important to ask, why does this notion of our waking experience not being ultimately real prove so enduring? Why does some version of this perspective show up over and over again across time and space within human experience, evident in everything from Vedanta to Buddhism to Jungian depth psychology? Perhaps even more compelling, at least to modern ears, why are elements of this perspective evident in our most cutting-edge physics, astronomy, and neuroscience? More to the point, if this is indeed a truer apprehension of ultimate reality, then what are the implications, and how now shall we live? These are precisely the matters that we'll seek to unpack in this, the 118th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. As we begin this week's episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support this podcast and my work in general, and in so doing gain access to all of my content, which includes not only the regular podcast I release on a weekly basis publicly, but also the feature series I create, as well as OTC Squared, as well as early access and discounts to online courses and in-person retreats, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. Now, speaking of online courses, I have a new course that's coming up starting in September that I want to tell you a little bit about. This course is titled Techniques of Transcendence, and this course is a 12-week online course beginning on September 9th The format involves a mixture of presentations, guided meditations, individual practice, and group interactions. And here we will move beyond the abstract and into the actual techniques that clear distortions and tune us into the underlying unified field. In the process, we will uncover/recover a sense of belonging we've always known exists in the deepest recesses of our being. Now, this course is very pertinent to today's podcast because this touches on Gnostic notions. This course will talk about the following stages of inner liberation. We begin with disillusionment, realizing that the promises of the world, pleasure, status, ideology, etc., are empty. Then we move to remembrance, recalling or receiving inner knowledge of our true home. Next comes purification, letting go of attachments, false identity, and ego structures. Then we move to ascent, moving through the barriers, whether you want to call them archonic levels or psychic veils, that obscure full awareness. And finally, we arrive at reunion, a return to the source, the pleroma, the fullness, via inner union. The course will meet via Zoom video on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern, that's 11 p.m. UTC, starting again on Tuesday, September 9th, 2025. All sessions will be recorded and provided to course participants, so it's okay if you can't always be there. And participation in the course also involves having access to a private Signal group where we will discuss the matters that we are talking about ongoingly, as well as the practices that we're engaging in. So this starts on September 9th. The registration for this class opens up on Monday morning, so look for that. And you can find information about the class at essenceofbeing.info. That's essenceofbeing.info. And right at the center of the page, on the home page, you'll find a link to describe the course, and you can register there as of Monday. I also want to point out that in this season, the fall season, I actually won't be teaching expanding awareness this time. I've done it 4 times in a row. I'm going to take a break from that. So this course is open to anyone who's taken expanding awareness or anyone who's not taken a class yet can sign up for this Techniques of Transcendence course. Hope to see some of you there when we start on September 9th. Okay, with that extra long preamble aside, let's move into today's topic. So today we're going to talk about Gnosticism. What is Gnosticism? Well, as I said in the introduction, gnosis is a Greek term meaning knowledge, but it's specifically direct experiential knowledge of the divine or ultimate reality rather than belief based on faith, authority, or doctrine. Now, in describing this episode, I said, upcoming on PoC, interactions with non-human beings arising from subsuming realms, psionics, mind control, states and stages of consciousness, and the way of liberation via the Gnostic path. So really front and center here is this notion of the Gnostic path. And as I said already, this speaks to direct experiential knowledge. It is not conceptual. It is not referential. This is a key distinction. It's a distinction that's hard for Westerners to really grok because we've been taught that all there really is conceptual knowledge. Now, before we kick off here, I want to reference several books that I read in preparation for this episode that you might want to dig into as well. One of those books is Gnostic Philosophy, From Ancient Persia to Modern Times by Tobias Churton. Another is titled The Gnostic Jung and the 7 Sermons to the Dead by Stefan Holyer. Another is The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, a book I've referenced on several occasions. Another is Shankara's Crest Jewel of Discrimination, Timeless Teachings on Non-Duality. Then we have The Red Book by Carl Jung himself. And finally, Wholeness and the Implicate Order by David Bohm. Each of these books played a role in my preparation for today's episode. So, gnosis, this notion of direct experiential knowledge. Why would we assume this is even possible? Why would we assume this isn't just people interpreting experiences? Why would they have direct access to something? Well, it's because, of course, as we've been discussing for some time now, the ultimate reality is non-dual. In that sense, everything is one. There's this underlying undifferentiated field. Again, these are things we will get into in that course. And because of that, we are everything. We are the totality. We are localized into a certain vantage point within this frame, this material world frame, which we're going to uncover and look at more closely today. But in a more overarching sense, we are the totality. We are the oneness of everything. So it is a part of us. So the point here is that just as we know our own inner experience, we can know the inner experience of the universe itself, of everything. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, there are actually many different traditions or schools of thought that tend towards this kind of notion that ultimate reality is outside of this context, that the material world, the duality, all the myriad forms we see in front of us, that's all actually illusory from this perspective. The ultimate reality is one of undivided union, a oneness that includes everything, where there is the freedom from even the possibility of lack. Try to imagine that kind of experience. Now, while there are many traditions that speak to this, another reason why I'm discussing this today, and I've been discussing elements of this over the last few months, is because of my experience on Christmas Day. Many of you will be familiar with this by now. This was Christmas Day 2024, when I used a certain protocol to end up in a kind of experiential frame that felt completely outside of this context, which is to say outside of the notion of space-time and even of Darren, of the small self. This was eclipsed by this unitive experience of feeling like I was everything. Now, I've discussed various elements of this over a few different podcasts over the past few months, but some of it is difficult to describe because of the inherent limitations of language and how notions of subject and object and of space-time are embedded or assumed within it. What I have discussed most often is how obvious it was to me, and directly again, not conceptually, a kind of gnosis we're speaking of here, that this realm is not real like we think it is. The second element involved the sense that there is a nefarious overlay here designed to limit human awareness and potential. Now, we'll unpack both of these notions, but I want to point out again that this was a noetic understanding. This wasn't conceptual. This wasn't referential. This wasn't me adding up 2 and 2 to get to 4. This was a direct awareness that hit me as strongly as anything I've ever known. I want to say known, not believed, because again, we know our own inner experience. This was what this was like, an inner experience of the totality. And in coming back to this material existence in the incarnational realm, I had a very strong sense. It was immediate, it was visceral, and it was largely unquestionable that this is not real, not like we think it is. Now, this raises many, many questions, hence the exploration into Gnostic notions today. Of course, one of the questions is, if this is not ultimately real, if this is not ultimately base reality, then what is it exactly? Why is it here? Why are we experiencing it? Is it an accident? Is it deliberate? Is it a ruse? Is it a trap? These are questions that emerge for people. Now, a key point that I want to make here is that which perspective you choose will say a lot about where you are at in your journey. Now, some people might not like that notion, but what we're getting to here today, and we're going to unpack this in a lot of detail, is that all of this, everything we ever experience out there, as it were, is an extrapolation, an implication of our inner awareness, of our own psychic journey. We have a shared frame that we tend to think of as consensus reality, but then it's constructed as a result of our shared agreement around it. And as that falls away, then perhaps the construct itself falls away. Perhaps that's how we get out of the matrix, how the matrix might fall apart from the seams, as it were. These are some of the questions that arise here. If this is not ultimately real, if this is some sort of projection, is there a way to end the projection? Is there a way to escape this experience, either individually or collectively? Or is there a way that we can together, based on what we adhere to, what we cohere around in terms of our sense of reality, collapse the very construct itself? These are some of the questions that arise, questions that we will explore today as we delve into different traditions and how they've treated this. Because again, I want to emphasize here, there is no one agreed upon kind of notion in terms of what we should make of this construct other than the fact that it's not ultimately real. So each of these traditions generally agree on that notion. But why it's arising, how it arose to begin with, there's some disagreement there. So we will explore those different elements, those different nuances, those different wrinkles. But I do want to point out again that this is not just conceptual, because again, this is partly an implication, a consequence of our own journey. And I say that because while I do believe there are different levels of this manifest reality, so it's not just one flattened dimensional existence here in the incarnational realm, there's different levels here as well. And within those different levels, there are different stages of consciousness. And depending on what stage of consciousness a particular being or intelligence or species is at, they will sometimes either work for the greatest good of the totality, or if they're still believing in a duality, believing that they are separate, believing that we live with finite resources. If they believe that, and they believe that's ultimately all there is, then they're going to compete against others. They're going to sometimes suppress, dominate, and try to control others, so to control those resources and to even use lesser species or species earlier on in their development as a kind of resource themselves. So here we have the notion of a prison planet, of people being used as cattle, as humanity being used as cattle. We have notions of loosh, that we basically gas out this kind of energy, and when it's negative, it's consumed by certain kinds of entities, because again, not all entities are physical. And even we as so-called physical beings are not ultimately physical, we are energetic. And whether we're aware of it or not, every time we think a thought, every time we enact an action, we are letting out, we are emitting into the cosmos, if you will, though again, it's not physical, into the totality, certain kinds of energy, which can be consumed by these other kinds of intelligences, these other kinds of entities, much like how we share our environment with many different small microscopic elements of the biome. Our body is filled with some of these beings. So this happens at every level. And what level you zoom in on is kind of relative and arbitrary, because ultimately you can zoom as many times as you want, infinitely, but ultimately it's all one thing at the same time. So we have these different levels that scale up and scale down, and we have beings that will use people, will use species, will use intelligences, will use planets, and on it goes. But we need not be, therefore, their prisoners. And the reason why, of course, and it's really important to highlight this, to underline this, is because this is not ultimately real. So when we tap into this non-dual reality, when we tap into this oneness, this unified field beyond that transcends this realm altogether, then we are free from that attempted imprisonment. Because again, we are only prisoners as long as we believe we are, as long as we believe this could even function like a prison. But if we are ultimately just a localized vantage point of the totality, of everything, of oneness itself, of source, then we cannot be contained, we cannot be imprisoned. In fact, the unsatisfactory nature of this experience within perhaps a kind of prison from a certain perspective is what often wakes us up to the deeper realm, to the overarching transcendent reality. So different ways to think about this, and we really want to think about ourselves as agents of consciousness and be aware of, be extremely radically transparent with ourselves around our relationship with ourselves, with other people, with the cosmic community, and with reality itself. Because whatever we believe about it is likely going to determine the very nature of our experience. Okay, now let's get into some of the different traditions and what they would say about this. Because again, this is very well attested to. This is not a rare conception in some corner of the internet. This has been front and center across culture, across time. In fact, if there's any group that perhaps is uneducated about this, it would be us in the modern West. But this notion of an idealistic view of reality where everything is ultimately mentation processes beyond physical appearances, this notion that anything in the dualistic realm is ultimately not real, is subsumed by this non-material existence, this is extremely common across human civilization throughout our entire existence. And again, the reason why is because we have direct access to this understanding. This is a felt sense of self, of the ultimate self, the capital S self. That's why it's so well attested to. But again, there are some differences in interpretation. So let's delve into some of those. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's not just these ancient traditions like Vedantic philosophy and Buddhism, but even more recent schools of thought and fields of inquiry that have also identified this kind of notion of reality. So this would involve quantum physics, the holographic universe theory, and even simulation theory arise as an implication of this subsuming reality. So ideas from quantum physics, the holographic universe theory, and simulation theory have significantly contributed to renewed interest in Gnosticism, especially in non-traditional philosophical and digital age spiritual circles. This overlap isn't in the form of hard proof or doctrinal alignment, but rather intellectual resonance. So let's dive into how these intersect. And again, this is really interesting because as we've developed our own virtual reality, as we've developed more and more realistic video games that are immersive in nature, we've realized that this daily waking experience might just be a more elaborate example of the very same thing. When we look at the holographic universe understanding, we realize that what looks like physicality, what looks like 3 dimensions and space and time might ultimately, more foundationally, not be like that at all. That anything spatial temporal might just be an extension and part of our experience, but not actually indicative of the underlying reality. So let's first talk about the overlap between Gnosticism and simulation theory. So a core Gnostic claim is that the material world is a flawed illusion created by a lesser being, the demiurge, and true reality lies beyond. I want to point out that there's different ways to describe Gnostic views, and not all Gnostic traditions agree on this. There's some different perspectives. Again, I would say it's because of people's different relationship with themselves and with reality and each other that lead them to different conclusions about the nature of this demiurge, what the demiurge even ultimately represents. So don't get caught up too much in the notions, in the names. Think more about these as stepping stones across a pond that get us closer to some ultimate reality. So while some versions of Gnosticism talk about this being a flawed illusion created by a lesser being, a demiurge, who is falsely identified as ultimate God, in simulation theory, as postulated by people like Nick Bostrom, there's this suggestion that our reality might be a programmed illusion run by a higher intelligence, a programmer of sorts. Of course, this fits with our more recent understanding of programs and programmers. So if this is actually a programmed virtual reality, then many people would postulate there must be a programmer on the other side of that. So these ancient traditions would talk about this in terms of a god, small g, with delusions of grandeur, thinking they are the ultimate God. And again, they are just themselves a refraction of source. So we don't have this delineation between mortal beings and gods with a small g. We have this notion that there's many different kinds of levels and different kinds of beings that are slotted within those levels, but that they ultimately are rising from this oneness. Now, with simulation theory, as we just suggested, this is not described in terms of gods with a small g, but in terms of a programmer, a higher intelligence that's programmed this apparent virtual reality. Now let's think about Gnosticism and the overlap with the holographic universe, which we've already discussed a little bit. So with the holographic principle, which we see evidenced from black hole thermodynamics and string theory, there's this notion that the universe is a kind of 2D projection with information encoded on a distant surface. Many people have actually suggested this within astrophysics, that our universe, our perceived universe, might be within a black hole itself, and the reality of it is actually held in 2D form around the ring of this black hole, and that the 3D projection is just that, it's a projection. It's experienceable, it seems real, but it is ultimately not. Now, this, of course, overlaps with the Gnostic notion that the physical is not fundamental and that true existence is non-material and located in a higher dimension of being, the pleroma. So within thermodynamics and astrophysics, we still have this notion of higher dimensions, that we might be the projection, the lower projection of these higher realms, if you will, these higher dimensions, these more subtle dimensions. Well, this aligns with Gnostic perspectives. Then we have the overlap with Gnosticism and quantum mechanics. So in quantum phenomena, such as non-locality, entanglement, and wave function collapse, the observer effect challenges mechanistic materialism. This has been the huge revelation that we've had to grapple with over the last 100 years or so. Well, of course, Gnostic frameworks would interpret these phenomena as hints that consciousness, not matter, is primary, supporting the idea that reality is shaped or constrained by a lesser mind. Again, here we run into the notion of the demiurge. But here also, really importantly, is the notion that the observer plays a role in creating our experience of the world itself. So the wave function collapse being instantiated by a conscious observer is akin to the Gnostic notion that we are creating this reality. We're at least holding it up, if you will, that it may have been created by some other being, some other slice of consciousness, but that we, with our shared coherent notion of this, are propping it up and keeping it going on and on and on. All right, so let's think about cultural impacts, cultural implications here, because different thinkers over the last 100 years or so have also played with this idea. So thinkers like Philip K. Dick, who we've discussed a couple different times, invoked Gnosticism directly in relation to simulation experiences, and they helped to bridge esoteric metaphysics with sci-fi and philosophical discourse. So again, this has sprung up more recently in terms of sci-fi notions, the simulation hypothesis, etc. And of course, people like Philip K. Dick talked about jumping across timelines, experiencing parallel universes. Well, this also fits with this notion that everything is ultimately consciousness, and that this experiential realm, where things look separate and distinct, is ultimately illusory. Different documentaries and podcasts increasingly refer to ancient Gnostic cosmologies as conceptual ancestors of modern metaphysical speculation. Now, key here is that digital culture has played a major role in reviving Gnostic ideas. This is true of memes, Reddit posts, and AI-generated thought experiments that often converge around themes like false reality, the archons, which is a Gnostic notion, awakening, or escaping the matrix. These are all drawn directly from Gnostic motifs. So this has really gained steam more recently because of the very realities that we are creating, the virtual realities we are creating. So let's think about academic and philosophical recognition. So scholars have explored how Gnostic cosmologies map surprisingly well onto postmodern, post-materialist ontologies. And others point out that existential tension, both in Gnosticism and in modern physics. So we can probe the structure of the world with our quantum measurements, but something always remains hidden or unknowable, akin to the veil that Gnostics sought to pierce. So this is true. When we try to measure things at the very small scale and the very large scale, our physics breaks down. Space-time ceases to be coherent. So that seems to suggest that this cannot be real. Physicists like Nima Arkani-Hamed, who I've mentioned on numerous occasions, are saying this, that the math itself tells us that space-time cannot be foundational, therefore cannot really be real, not foundationally real. It's a projection from a deeper reality. So we see this evidenced everywhere. It's pretty astounding. So here the notion is the demiurge equals the simulation architect or the programmer. In the Gnostic notion, the demiurge is an ignorant or malevolent creator of the material world who is distinct from the true divine source that is beyond conception altogether. And this parallels with scientific and philosophical perspectives which speak of a simulation hypothesis and the notion that the programmer or civilization running the simulation may be indifferent, flawed, or deceptive. So this mirrors the notion of the demiurge. And you'll see again how we change our language to reflect what we're experiencing now. This is the dance of experience altogether, that as we evolve our notions of reality based on our interaction, our relationship with it, that in turn changes our understanding of the nature of reality. And the key here is that that may indeed change the nature of reality, because consensus reality is always just whatever we believe it to be. And this fits with, for instance, Rupert Sheldrake's notion that there are no laws of nature, there are only habits of nature. They are temporary. They carry on until they no longer do, when they are replaced with something else that arises as a result of direct relationship. We really have to wrap our heads and hearts around that before we can really make sense of the nature of our experience. All right, now that we've looked at some of the parallels with quantum physics, with astronomy, and with the simulation hypothesis, let's move on to some of our more ancient non-dual traditions and how they also parallel notions that arise in Gnosticism. So again, the key here is that this construct may be collapsible. If it's only being held up by our belief in it, then it no longer is propped up the second that belief is not there. It's like the oxygen that gets sucked out of the room, if you will. So this, again, is mirrored across different traditions, not just in Gnosticism, but also in Buddhism and in Vedanta. So let's describe some of the nuances and how they are slightly different. So the theme, of course, is that this world is illusory. The material realm is an illusion. So within Gnosticism, the material world is a deceptive construct by the demiurge, although I want to point out here that even within Gnosticism, there are more nuanced perspectives. Some are more subtle. For instance, Valentinianism has a more subtle argument here, and I think aligns more with the conception I would have and others might have. But that's one way that Gnosticism looks at this. Buddhism would say that samsara is impermanent and illusory. So everything we're experiencing here, this is Maya, that is illusion. In Vedanta, all forms are illusion. Again, there's this notion of Maya, and only Brahman is real, this unitive, undifferentiated, pure awareness. Now, let's think about the notion of the real self and how these different traditions think about this. So in Gnosticism, there's this notion that we are a divine spark arising from the pleroma, this deeper realm. In Buddhism, we have the sense that we ultimately have Buddha nature, that we all have Buddha nature, and that it's only the grime of our distortions, if you will, that prevents some of us from recognizing and living into our Buddha nature. And in Vedanta, there's the notion that Atman equals Brahman, so pure non-dual consciousness. Now, what is the cause of the bondage of being trapped here, if you will? Again, trapped being a conditional term based on our experience and our relationship with reality. Well, in Gnosticism, this arises as a result of ignorance of origin and deception by archons, these beings that are in levels higher than this one, between source and us, if you will. Now, in Buddhism, there's the notion that this bondage arises as a result of ignorance and craving. So by transcending those, we transcend this realm altogether. And in Vedantic thought, again, there's ignorance of the non-dual nature of things as being ultimate reality, and ego identification. That is the problem. That's what's causing the bondage. So what is the path of liberation in each of these? So for Gnosticism, not surprising, the path of liberation is one of gnosis, inner knowing of one's own experience as the totality. In Buddhism, it's enlightenment, awakening to emptiness. And in Vedantic thought, it's knowledge of capital S, self, as being our ultimate nature. So we recognize that we are basically believing in a puff of smoke as ourselves, that once that clears, we see we are everything. That is our ultimate nature. So what about the mass awakening result that could arise here? This is something we hear talked about a lot in recent times, this notion that a mass awakening is underway. How do these different traditions think about this? Well, in Gnostic thought, as we've already discussed, this arises because of a collapse of the simulation or the construct. In Buddhism, it's because of the cessation of samsara. And in Vedantic thought, it's dissolution of Maya and return to Brahman. So a lot of commonality here, slightly different terms based on different experiences of reality, different conceptual framings, but a lot of overlap nonetheless. So what happens if enough beings awaken? Well, in Gnosticism, the construct collapses as divine sparks return to the pleroma. The demiurge then is disempowered. The archons fall into confusion or non-existence. They are actually reintegrated into the totality again. And this perceived reality burns off like fog in sunlight, not violently, but ontologically. Ultimately, there is a restoration of divine wholeness. Sophia reunites with the ions. And again, those are just different notions of what happens when source spills out into ever more dense layers. The ions, Sophia, the demiurge are those higher levels, but not ultimately source level, between us and source actually. All of that gets reintegrated into source when the construct dissolves, when we, in our awareness, realize it's not ultimately real. So we think here of a Gnostic text, the Gospel of Philip, which says, "Truth did not come into the world naked, but in symbols and images. It will be revealed in fullness when all become one." And let's quickly run through both Buddhism and Vedantic thought and how they look at this. So within Buddhism, samsara and nirvana are not different. When ignorance ends, duality dissolves. And if all beings attain awakening, which is the bodhisattva ideal, samsara is emptied. The illusory world ceases to bind, and experience becomes the spontaneous play known as lila, of pure awareness. And texts here describe the final state as self-liberation of appearances. Illusion remains, but no one is bound by it. So it's not a bondage anymore. We think of the Heart Sutra, which says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. That is the heart of non-duality. Now let's look at Vedanta quickly. Here the notion is that when realization dawns that Atman equals Brahman, the illusion, known as Maya, is transcended. And if enough people, that is to say individual selves with a small s, realize this, the play of separation ends. The world doesn't disappear, but is seen as a projection, as what it really is, like a dream no longer mistaken for reality. That is largely the perspective I've had ever since my Christmas Day experience. Here, liberation is collective and individual. One self wakes up through many bodies, that self with a capital S, realizing again that ultimately we're all one being. All right, now let's look at another parallel. Here we're going to look at Jung, Carl Jung, and depth psychology. I mentioned this in the introduction. Again, it's really striking how many traditions actually agree on these same basic notions. They use some different terminology based on conceptions of specific cultures, but the underlying notions are remarkably similar. So Carl Jung enters the Gnostic conversation as one of the 20th century's most important interpreters and rehabilitators of Gnosticism, not as a theologian, but as a depth psychologist. And that's a key distinction. We'll get into that as we unpack it. He didn't just study Gnosticism, he recognized it in a profound symbolic map of the psyche and believed that ancient Gnostic texts describe inner psychological realities long before modern psychology had the language to do so. Now, in researching Jung, I want to recommend this excellent book, The Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead by Stephen Hollier. This was key in my understanding of Jung and how he applies here. So, key contributions of Jung to Gnostic thought. So Jung proposed that Gnostic myths were not outdated theology, but profound psychological metaphors. Now think again to recent episodes where I've discussed that these are both metaphors and real, that this distinction gets obliterated in this deeper understanding, that subject-object distinctions become decimated by this deeper perspective. So let's do this side-by-side comparison between Jungian depth psychology and Gnostic notions. So in Gnosticism, we have this notion again of the demiurge. Some people would describe him as ignorant and himself kind of buying too much into his own notions of himself and the nature of reality. And so in that sense, he's a tragic figure as well as an imprisoner. Other people see him as evil and actually responsible for the prison we find ourselves in, the prison of the material world. Again, nuanced perspectives there, and the more subtle you become, the more you recognize that the demiurge itself is also a figure arising from the one who is, to a large degree, responding via illusion. All right, then we have this notion within Jungian interpretation of the ego or the false self that mistakes itself for the totality of consciousness. So this is what Jung would say in reference to the notion of the demiurge. Now in Gnosticism, we have the notion of pleroma. In a Jungian sense, this refers to the collective unconscious or archetypal totality beyond ego awareness. In Gnosticism, we have the notion of Sophia, which we already referenced. Here, Jung would say this refers to the soul's yearning to return to wholeness, the archetype of divine wisdom. Here we think of anima and psyche. Now, what about this notion of gnosis itself? Well, Jung would describe this as individuation. That is to say, direct inner experience of the capital S self, not mediated by dogma or institution. Because again, it's a direct awareness, it's a felt sense, it's a self-awareness arising from the ultimate self, the capital S self, source. So Jung called Gnostics the first depth psychologists because they externalized inner psychic processes as mythic narratives. Now, the key again is that some people want to say here, oh, so you're referring to metaphors, to representations in mentation versus reality, in other words, physicality. That distinction again gets obliterated here. We are transcending that we are including these different notions and comparing them, but also ultimately transcending them altogether. So Jung's book, The Red Book, and Active Imagination play a key role here. In his Red Book, which I also read parts of in reference to this episode, which was written between 1913 and 1930. I highly recommend this book. I've read it before. It's a trip, to say the least. Jung recorded visionary experiences using what he called active imagination. These experiences paralleled Gnostic cosmology and included encounters with the divine feminine, evil rulers, and luminous beings. And he suggested a personal gnosis outside any church or system, aligning again with the Gnostic insistence on direct knowing. Jung's own encounters mirrored the descent into a psychic underworld, much like the soul's journey through the archonic spheres. So again, different terms to describe the same basic process, and ultimately experiential process. That's the key. So let's think about the way that Jung updated this kind of terminology and brought back into focus this Gnostic perspective. So Jung reframed Gnostic myth as depth psychology. Myths describe archetypal psychic structures. Again, they are real, though. That's the key we're going to get to a little bit later, that Jung ultimately saw the physical world, what we experience in our day-to-day lives, as the flip side of the coin of the manifestation of the collective unconscious, that those ultimately psychic elements in the collective unconscious of which we're all a part, that determines the nature of our existence. Major parallels again there with Gnosticism. Jung validated gnosis as inner experience, so direct knowing is greater than institutional belief. Now, of course, Carl Jung, born and raised in Europe, was very familiar with Christian notions, but he revealed Christ as a psychological archetype, a symbol of the capital S self again, not just a savior figure, so transcending and including there again. He criticized religious repression. He saw orthodoxy as a denial of the full psyche. So, in other words, this repression of the collective shadow results in the outward manifestation of repressive religions. And he blended ancient and modern gnosis. He built a bridge between ancient cosmology and modern self-realization. Again, just different terms to describe the same process. So in Jung's view, and in many aligned metaphysical systems actually, psychic structures are not merely internal symbolic forms, but can take on outer manifestation, including within physical reality or nested layers of constructs. Again, here he is emphasizing nested layers, different levels of reality within manifestation that have spilled out from source, from the one unified field. I see it that way as well. I think that helps us make sense of the UFO phenomenon, as well as different kinds of encounters over time, fairy lore that Nathan and I discussed on liminal frames, etc. So Jung didn't view the psyche as a sealed-off subjective chamber, but rather as a co-creator of the world itself. And in his way, Jung moved strikingly close to a Gnostic or simulation-informed kind of metaphysics. One wonders, what would Jung say today about the simulation hypothesis, were he aware of it with our modern technology in our modern context? Now let's delve into further unpacking symbol and reality, because again, Jung had a very nuanced perspective here. So Jung wrote that matter and psyche are not two things, but two aspects of one deeper reality. In Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, which is sitting over there on my bookshelf, he wrote, quote, "Psyche and matter are contained in one and the same world, and moreover are in continuous contact with one another." And this leads to two major implications. Number one, physical reality is symbolic and participatory. We've been saying this recently on recent podcasts. Therefore, what appears externally is a mirror of internal psychic processes, personal and collective, as I just said a few minutes ago. The collective unconscious, with its archetypes and motifs, may literally structure what we perceive as real. And number two, that there's no hard barrier between mind and world. Again, we are obliterating these distinctions. The manifest world, according to Jung, is not separate from the psyche. It's a co-generated or projected field. And this, of course, dovetails with Gnostic cosmology, where the world, in quotes there, we experience, is not ultimate reality, but a projection rooted in deeper psychic spiritual dynamics, possibly distorted, suppressed, or inverted by the demiurgic principle. So, do psychic structures take on form in reality, one might ask? Well, according to Jung, they do. So yes, via projection and symbolic instantiation, these things do become real. In other words, we experience them as the physical objects of our world, of our daily waking experience. Archetypes are transpersonal. In other words, we all can tap into these archetypes. They are the bedrock of what we perceive in form, and they precede and shape both inner experience and outer events. Again, both and. When activated, especially collectively, again, consensus reality here, they can constellate patterns in history, culture, politics, and even physical events. Think of mass hysteria, the rise of ideologies, or collective dreams, and mythic patterns in times of upheaval, including during, for instance, world wars, and even social breakdown, social tension, as we are experiencing as Americans here in the United States. Apologies to everyone else who's also experiencing this as we work out our collective drama, which again, of course, is arising, is manifesting because of the dynamics in our collective shadow. Now, speaking of shadow, collective and individual, the point here is that when ignored, it, quote unquote, takes on a body in the world. Hence, what you do not bring to consciousness appears in your life as fate, is something Jung was known to say. So let's think about these different layers. If you extend Jung's system into a metaphysical model with layers of reality, then one layer is the material world. This would be the field of archetypal projection. And the Gnostic equivalent would be the lowest realm, illusion shaped by archons. In Jung's perspective, with the personal unconscious, would be all about biographical material. In the Gnostic notion, this would be the soul realm entangled in the construct. Then think about the collective unconscious. Here Jung would speak of archetypes, mythic DNA, if you will. The Gnostic equivalent would be aeonic source, divine sparks, and Sophia. Unus mundus, one world. From Jung's perspective, the underlying unity of psyche and matter is spoken to here. In the Gnostic notion, it would be pleroma, the realm of pure being. So yes, absolutely, Jung would affirm that psychic structures can take form in layered constructs, including psychological symptoms, cultural patterns, meaningful coincidences, quote unquote, which of course we think of as synchronicities, even in geopolitical or technological realities that manifest the psychic imbalance of a collective. He didn't explore simulation theory per se, as we already said, but he did articulate a world where the outer is psychically structured and constructs can emerge from internal dynamics. Indeed, that all constructs ultimately arise as an implication of internal dynamics. So what can we say then in conclusion when we think about Jung's perspectives as well as Gnostic philosophy and notions that arise from simulation theory? Well, these worlds, both Jung's world, Gnostic metaphysics, and simulation theory, converge on one profound insight. Reality is shaped from within. Awakening to this fact is not merely psychological, it is ontological and existential. The path of liberation is the path of remembrance, resonance, I would say, reintegration and reclamation of the self, capital S, as both creator and redeemer of experience. When we realize that, the construct collapses and we return to this unit of experience. We return to an experience of pure, unfettered awareness that again is also spoken to in Hinduism and Buddhism, and that furthermore is also attested to in channeled material, such as the raw contact material, also known, not coincidentally, as the law of one, which speaks to these different densities that ultimately speak to experience, the redeeming of experience, the transcending of realms, and ultimately reunification with Source itself, which is, of course, none other than what we ultimately already are. It's only the distortions that prevent us from seeing it. That's why this practice of clearing distortions is so key. This again speaks to what we'll get into in the Techniques of Transcendence course, because we can clear the grime from the mirror, if you will, by clearing these distortions. And what do we find when we eventually arrive at a clear mirror? We find that we are representing everything, that is actually our self-identity. Now, we've talked about different traditions today. We've talked about different language that's used to describe the same underlying notions. But as I said earlier, we should think about these notions in terms of the concepts, the words we use, the metaphors we choose as temporary, as the stones we step on to get across the pond, that when we turn around, the stones are no longer there. They are the scaffolding that's useful as long as it's useful, and then when it's not, it falls away. In different traditions in non-dual circles, these are spoken about as the gateless gate to the pathless path, if you will. This seems like a contradiction, but it's because there's this understanding that experience is arising based on our interaction with reality, and that as those notions are transcended, those earlier realities fall away as illusion, as fog melted in the morning sun. So speaking of this notion of distinguishing between the underlying reality and the conceptions we use to describe the reality, I want to finish with a quote from this book, The Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead, by Stephen Holyer, because he speaks to this directly. He says, quote, "It becomes necessary for us now to give some expression to the model of reality as it appears within the texts of the ancient Gnostics, as it may be usefully amplified by the modern statement of gnosis offered to us by Jung. Gnosis is formless, since ultimate reality is always beyond conceptual grasp. It was precisely this perception of ultimate reality that inspired the teachers and writers of ancient Gnosticism and fired them to amazing heights of original creative accomplishment in the spiritual field. Modern psychology and ancient Gnosticism are but pointers to truths that are actually encountered in the vital experience of personal psychic transformation. Experience itself is always individual and can never be adequately expressed or interpreted by arranging sets of concepts and doctrines, for concepts are only indications of similarities within experience. Gnostics and psychologists must both be on their guard against the danger that they might mistake formulae for wisdom, and thus fall into the same dark pit into which theology plunged headlong and fatally. The established systems and forms of knowledge can do no more than put up signposts and indicate the explored roads that lead to the edge of this forest where the task of solitary exploration begins. Thus, religious and quasi-religious disciplines, as well as modern psychology, can point to significant common situations in the quest after gnosis, but they are in reality only a shorthand of the language of the soul. To be abandoned as real contact with the deeper layers of spirit is achieved. The danger of all systems is that they tend to mistake the words which serve as pointers for the realities to which they point. We may use terms of a Gnostic derivation, such as Sophia or Abraxas, or on the other hand, we may employ psychological terms, such as anima, animus, and shadow. But in all instances, we must be extremely careful that we do not earmark them as known because named, thus depriving ourselves of authentic gnosis. Life is never static, and the inner life least of all. So it would be improper to refer to any definable gnosis or individuation as a final achievement. We are ever becoming, but never become. All systems must beware of assuming that they are making true, in other words, ultimate, I would add here, statements about reality. When they come to rationalize their symbols and begin to look upon them as truths, they will soon be fossilizing their insights and thus soon destroy their empirical value as signposts on the way. At the portal of true gnosis, all isms, even Gnosticism, must vanish. Similarly, the psychologist must be willing to sacrifice his allegiance to a psychological system when he begins to deal with true individuation. Unquote. So this is the truth here. This is the invitation to experience, to true gnosis, which we do have access to as fractal shards of the one original mind. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.